Hi, my name is Christina, and before delving into what's happening to me right now, I should probably tell you a little about my life, because otherwise you won't understand why certain events have left such a deep mark on me. I'm 33 years old, and for almost 10 years now I've been working as a dentist in a private clinic, a responsible job that requires utmost concentration, but overall quite stable and predictable. My life seems quite ordinary. I have my own apartment, albeit one bought with a mortgage, for which I'm still paying off. I have a job with a routine that's scheduled almost down to the minute, and I have small joys, like a cup of coffee early in the morning and evening walks after a tough appointment. It seems like everyone else's life, but honestly, there's always something more hidden behind the calm exterior. But where should I even begin when it comes to family? Everything that mattered began when I was still a child. My father was only 42 when his heart gave out, and a sudden stroke took his life, leaving me a 12-year-old girl in a world that seemed alien and empty to me at the time. My mother, of course, held on with all her might, but I remember how she cried at night, thinking I was asleep and couldn't hear her sobs. And then, 2 years later, when I turned 14, my mother met a man named Gasper and married him. He already had a daughter, 9-year-old Maura, and with them, new people, new habits, new smells and voices moved into our house, the very one that had once belonged to my father. Truth be told, it was strange at first. The walls where my father's spirit still lived suddenly found themselves filled with strange things, and I had to learn to accept this without pain. I tried to mend our relationship, and luckily, Maura turned out to be quite a sweet girl. We played video games together. I sometimes helped her with her homework, and there was something about her childlike spontaneity that kept me from feeling lonely. Gasper also turned out to be a nice person. He didn't pry uninvited, but he always found a way to show that he considered me part of his new family. He came to my school events, we had barbecues in the courtyard, and went on family vacations. It wasn't anything amazing, but it wasn't a tragedy either, just a normal, quiet life in which we existed together, respecting each other's boundaries. I liked that Gasper never tried to replace my father. He found his own path, and there was an honesty in that I valued. When I graduated from high school and entered medical school, everything began to change. School, internships, and my first professional steps, all of this gradually distanced me from my family. It wasn't that I consciously avoided them, but my time was spent on work, my energy on studying, and by the time I graduated and found a job at a clinic, I'd already established my own life, in which family only played a role on major holidays. We saw each other at Christmas, sometimes at Easter or Thanksgiving, exchanging short messages or photos on Facebook, and that seemed enough. Maura, of course, was also growing up. The last time I really kept in touch with her, she was in college, pursuing a career in business or something similar. We weren't as close as we'd been as children, but we didn't argue either. Things simply became less frequent, more formal, as often happens when children grow up and start living their own lives. And then something happened that reminded me again of the fragility of life. Last year, my grandmother, my mother-in-law, died, a woman who had always been special to me because she remained my last living link to my father. She was 89, had lived a long, dignified life, but her death still hit me hard, depriving me of that thin thread that connected me to my childhood and to the man I loved most. The funeral was difficult, but that day, my mother, Gasper, and Maura were again by my side. It was touching, as we hadn't all been together for probably over 2 years. After the service, we went to the lawyer's office to hear the will. Most of it was as expected, money divided among relatives, jewelry distributed by name, but at the end, something was said that literally shook me. My grandmother left me her apartment, a small, 2-room apartment, but in a good neighborhood, probably worth $250,000 or more. For some people it's a small thing, but for me it's an incredible gift that I didn't even know I needed. I remember leaving the lawyer's office with a slight tremor in my arms and legs, and we all went out for coffee to catch our breath. It was there, in a small cafe with the warm scent of cinnamon and fresh latte, that I first voiced my plan. Stirring the sugar in my mug with a spoon, I said I was going to rent out my grandmother's apartment, as the rental income would significantly speed up my mortgage payments. Mom and Gasper exchanged glances, and I immediately understood the exchange. Married couples have an amazing ability to communicate with their eyes, as if they can express an entire dialogue in a matter of seconds. Mom leaned toward me and quietly said they wanted to discuss something important with me. At that moment, Maura, who had been silent and thoughtful until then, suddenly perked up and confessed that she had been dating a man named David for 2 years. I froze, because I had no idea. 2 years, and I didn't even know. This clearly demonstrated how far I had drifted from my family. I smiled and congratulated her, though inside I was slightly confused, unsure where this conversation was heading. And then Mom extended her hand, squeezed my fingers tightly, and said that Maura and David were in a difficult situation. His lease was ending soon, and Maura was living in a tiny studio apartment, so Grandma's apartment would be perfect for them. I took a deep breath and quietly asked, "Do you want them to live there instead of me renting it out?" To which Maura quickly replied that it was only temporary, that she and David wanted to get a little better at getting their feet on the ground, save up for their own place, and then I could do with the apartment as I pleased. I glanced around the table, trying to discern something more than just words in their expressions. The faces of my loved ones, full of hope and quiet anticipation, carried a sincerity that was impossible to miss. This was my family, though brought together not by blood, but by circumstance and time. Maura was my sister, not by blood, but by the memories that had bound us together since our youth, with our games and conversations together, with her childhood whims that I had once smiled at, and I understood perfectly well that I didn't need the apartment itself, since I already had my own place, albeit burdened with a mortgage, and at that moment, this realization became decisive for me. "I think it will work," I said slowly, as if tasting each word, testing my readiness to let go of the income that could make my life easier. "And how long are we talking about?" Gasper carefully clarified, clearly wanting the agreement to be clear. He added that they could pay the utilities, maintain the apartment, and supervise its repairs. I nodded, letting the words cool a bit, and then said, "Okay, they can live there, but only for a year, and during that time you'll pay all the bills and keep the apartment in order." Maura beamed with joy, her eyes lit up, and her body seemed ready to jump out of her chair. "Thank you so much, Christina, you're just..." She hesitated, as if at a loss for words, and finally exhaled, "You're the best." Mom reached out and squeezed my hand with such warmth that for a moment I felt like that little girl again, desperately needing her father's support. "This means so much to all of us," she said quietly, but her voice was filled with gratitude that needed no further explanation. I smiled and nodded, but deep down I was already calculating how many months I'd have to tighten my belt to make the payments without the income the rent would bring in. And yet, I repeated to myself, family comes first. That's what my father would have done, and I couldn't do otherwise. Only 2 weeks had passed when Maura and David moved their things into my grandmother's apartment. I met David briefly to hand him the keys. He seemed a pleasant, calm, confident man. And although I didn't really know him, he made a good impression. He and Maura seemed happy, and the apartment looked well kept and cozy, everything in its place, without chaos or clutter, because Maura, just like as a child, always loved neatness. The months passed as usual. I continued to pay the mortgage using only my dentist's salary, and although it turned out to be more difficult than I expected, it was still bearable. I knew I could handle it, because I was used to working hard and knew how to live with an eye on expenses. Maura and David seemed to be settling in nicely, and I was happy for them, convincing myself I'd made the right choice. Family helps family, and that makes you feel better, I repeated in my head, even when I was postponing my next trip or purchase to make up for lost rental income. The year flew by. My work was intense. Each patient was more complex than the next, each capricious or requiring a special approach, and I was so immersed in my own concerns that I sometimes completely forgot that the apartment was still registered to Maura and David. They would occasionally text me, whether to report a leaky faucet or ask me to change a light bulb, though more often than not they handled it themselves. As David seemed to be a jack of all trades, this was actually comforting. I knew the apartment was in good hands and well maintained, plus, they were never late with the utility bills, and that was important, too. And yet, I knew I was losing money that could have made my life much easier, and I thought about it from time to time with a slight bitterness, but every time Maura and I talked and she thanked me for my help, I felt that perhaps there was more to this story than the simple arithmetic of income and expenses. That was until one March evening, when my phone rang. I was stirring pasta sauce on the stove when my mother's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Mom," I replied, putting the phone to my ear. "Hi, honey," came her warm voice. "We were wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner this weekend, Saturday, around 6 o'clock. "Sure, that sounds good. Should I bring you anything?" I asked, and her familiar voice came over the line. "Just for myself, well, maybe an apple pie from Miller's Bakery, too. You know Gaspard loves it." "Okay, Mom, I'll pick it up on the way," I smiled. That Saturday, I did indeed stop by that very same bakery, where the display cases always enticed with the scent of cinnamon and fresh dough, bought a large pie, and headed for my parents' house. As I pulled up, I noticed an unusual bustle in the driveway: Maura's Honda, David's pickup, and another car I'd never seen before. I was a little surprised, but didn't think much of it. When the doorbell rang, Gasper opened the door with a broad smile, as if he'd been waiting specifically for me, and led me into the dining room. My mother, Maura, and David were already gathered there, along with an elderly couple whose faces were unfamiliar to me. "These are my parents, Dave and Linda," David introduced them, and I placed the pie on the table and took an empty seat. It was a little strange seeing new people at what I perceived as a family dinner, but I tried to take it in stride. The conversation was casual at first. Gasper told his usual dad jokes, which made everyone wince but smile. I shared a few stories from the clinic, about patients with the most unusual problems, and everyone laughed, which lightened the mood a bit. I was already feeling more relaxed when I noticed Mom and Gasper exchanged the same glances they had shared in the coffee shop after Grandma's funeral, when their first big proposal had been made. "Actually, we had a reason for inviting you today," Mom said, carefully spooning the remains of the meal onto her plate. "We all have a small favor to ask of you." I raised an eyebrow, scanning the faces at the table, trying to figure out what this everyone was. Maura leaned forward, beaming, her eyes sparkling with joy. "David proposed to me," she said, raising her left hand so I could see the ring on her finger. "Congratulations," I said, trying to keep my voice warm and sincere, even though my heart was already starting to beat faster. As if sensing something was wrong, "When did this happen?" David, grinning and putting his arm around Maura's shoulders, replied, 2 weeks ago. "We're thinking of getting married in about 6 months, I smiled, nodded, and said, "That's wonderful. I'm so happy for you both." At that moment, Mom leaned forward slightly, her eyes glittering with that special expression I'd known since childhood and which always foreshadowed unpleasant conversations. "By the way, that's exactly what we wanted to talk to you about," she interjected. "We need your help with the wedding expenses." Maura quickly pulled a thick folder from under the table, opened it, and began to explain how she and David had meticulously planned everything, conducted research, and gotten quotes. Her voice trembled with delight and excitement. "The total comes out to about $80,000, she concluded, proudly placing the neatly arranged pages in front of me. I nearly choked on the water I'd just taken a sip of. 80,000. I repeated, stunned. $80,000 in one day? Silence fell. Every eye in the room turned to me with the same expectant expression, as if the answer was obvious and I simply had to say it. I clasped my hands in my lap and, trying to keep my voice even, asked, "What exactly do you want from me?" Maura bit her lip, exchanged a glance with David, then looked back at me and exhaled. "Well, you have a great job, and you're doing well financially. We were hoping you could help us." I looked into her eyes, and there was no plea or embarrassment there, only confidence that I would agree. "Maura, I'm happy to help with your wedding," I said calmly. "Really, but 80,000 is crazy. I can probably afford to give you maybe 20,000, and believe me, it will be a very generous wedding gift." As soon as I said those words, the mood at the table changed. Maura's face fell, David's brow furrowed, disappointment evident in his gaze. His parents exchanged glances, and their smiles vanished. A heavy silence fell. Everyone stared at me as if I'd said something completely unacceptable. Mom was the first to break the silence. Darling, her voice was soft, but there was a hint of disapproval in it. You have a good job and a decent income, you could easily give your sister that money for her wedding. I felt my cheeks flush, as if I'd been punched. I took a deep breath, trying not to lose my temper. Mom, I'm paying the mortgage, I'm trying to save for the future, I said. Maura suddenly snorted, her lips twisting into a sardonic smile. What future? She said loudly. You don't even have a boyfriend, so you have no future at all. At that moment, a general chuckle rang out around the table, not loud, but I heard the humiliation in it, and the sound made my throat tighten and my insides twist. My own family's laughter hit me harder than any words could. I slowly put down my fork and, trying to speak as clearly as possible, said, after saying that, I won't give you a cent for your wedding. If you want an expensive ceremony, save up for it yourself, with your own money. David's parents waved their hands, as if trying to defuse the tension. His mother, Linda, frowned and said, You're acting terribly, not at all like a sister. I turned to face her and looked her straight in the eye. Okay, I said coldly, then maybe you could pay $80,000 for your son's wedding? Linda paled and immediately backed down. We're retired, we don't have that kind of money. I shrugged, then let Maura and David live within their means and plan the wedding based on their own income. Maura stood up abruptly from her chair, her face flushed with anger. You know what? You're toxic, she shouted. You're humiliating me financially and acting arrogant. We need to take a break from our relationship. You won't be invited to the engagement or the wedding. I looked at my parents, expecting them to scold her, to tell her that such words were too much, that she couldn't kick her sister out of the table because of money, but my mother merely lowered her eyes, and Gasper nodded and said, By refusing to help, you're depriving yourself of your family. I looked at them all for a long moment. Then nodded slowly. I understand perfectly and accept your decision, I said firmly. I grabbed my purse and stood up from the table. Thank you for dinner. I walked out of that house, and no one called out to me, not a soul tried to stop me or take back their words. Silence followed me all the way to the car. I got behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove home in complete darkness. And only then did I notice that my hands were shaking so badly they could barely hold the steering wheel. Back at the apartment, I collapsed on the couch and sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, unable to believe what had just happened. My own family had just kicked me out because of money, and the irony was that I'd never had that much money. The next morning, I woke up still feeling angry and hurt. I spent the night barely sleeping. I replayed the dinner scene over and over in my head, hearing their laughter, seeing Maura calling me toxic and my mother silently accepting it. They acted as if I owed them $80,000 simply because I was a doctor. I made strong coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and decided, if they wanted to cut me out of their family, so be it, but I wouldn't let any of them take advantage of me again. I wasn't going to subsidize Maura's life and her fantasies of a lavish wedding while they treated me like trash. I opened ads for apartments for rent in the area around my grandmother's house and started calculating, how much could I earn if I rented out her place? Similar two-bedroom apartments cost around $1,000 a month, sometimes as much as $1,200 if the apartment was in good condition. $1,200 a month times 12 is over $14,000 a year, and that's exactly how much I was depriving myself of so Maura could live rent-free while saving for her ridiculous wedding. I sat over the numbers, and one clear decision grew within me. I was done with this. I picked up my phone and started scrolling through my contacts until I came across a familiar name, Mr. Martinez. I immediately recognized him, a patient of mine who always showed up for appointments on time, never missed a payment, and once, as he was leaving, handed me his business card, saying that if I ever needed legal help, I could contact him without hesitation. I took a deep breath and dialed his number. Mr. Martinez, this is Christina, your dentist, I began, feeling a little nervous. You once told me that if I needed legal advice, I could call you. Of course, Christina, his voice was calm and businesslike. How can I help you? I need to evict someone from an apartment I own, I said, trying to keep my voice firm. My stepsister lives there, but we don't have any lease or anything formal. I understand, it's a family emergency. He nodded into the phone, as if he'd seen me. Can we meet? Yes, of course, perhaps tomorrow afternoon at your office? Great, come on over. The next day, I headed downtown. The building where his office was located looked modern and impressive, glass walls, steel lines reflecting the autumn sun. I climbed the stairs, and the secretary smiled welcomingly and offered me coffee while I waited. Finally, the door opened, and Mr. Martinez invited me into his office. So, tell me everything in order, he said, sitting down opposite him. I started talking about how I inherited the apartment after my grandmother's death, about how the family persuaded me to let Maura live there temporarily, about how a temporary agreement turned into a year of rent-free housing. I explained how everything had changed since that fateful dinner when I was humiliated, and how I no longer saw any reason to support people who openly declare that I am no longer family. And now you want them to move out, he clarified. Yes, I replied, feeling bitterness welling up inside. They've made it clear I'm no longer related, so why should I continue to provide them with free housing? Mr. Martinez nodded. You have every right to evict them. Since there's no lease, they're essentially considered month-to-month tenants. All you have to do is give them enough notice. How much time do you need? 30 days, he said. That's plenty for cases like this. We drafted the notice right there in his office. It was simpler than I expected. The text, the signature, the date. He explained that I needed to send it certified mail for it to be legally binding. When I left his office, I felt relief for the first time in months, as if a heavy weight had been lifted slightly from my chest. On the way home, I stopped at the post office and mailed it. A registered letter with an eviction notice was sent directly to my grandmother's apartment, where Maura and David now lived. They were supposed to receive it by Wednesday. For the next 3 days, I lived as usual: work at the clinic, going to the gym, shopping at the supermarket, quiet evenings watching Netflix. My phone was almost always on silent. I didn't want to hear a single call from my family. But on Thursday afternoon, it literally exploded. Maura was calling, over and over, non-stop. I gave a fleeting smile and let the calls go to voicemail. By the time I got home from work, 17 missed calls were flashing on my screen. Then Mom started calling, then Gasper, and soon my inbox was filled with their increasingly panicked messages. Christina, call me back immediately. Mom's voice demanded. What kind of eviction notice is this? Honey, you can't be serious, Gasper's voice rang out. Call us, we need to talk, this is getting out of control. I hit delete without even listening to the end. Let them panic a little, let them feel what it's like to be ignored. The calls and messages continued for 2 more days, but I pretended not to notice them. I went to work, came home, went about my daily business, and my phone continued to vibrate somewhere off to the side, and I felt strangely calm. And then, on Friday evening, as I settled into the couch with a box of Chinese noodles and chopsticks in hand, the screen lit up with Maura's name again. This time, I picked up. What? I said dryly. Christina. Thank God you answered. Her voice trembled. What the hell is this eviction notice supposed to mean? It means you have 30 days to move out of my apartment, I said, calmly biting into my noodles. Are you crazy? You can't just kick us out. Actually, I can, I replied coldly. I consulted a lawyer. The apartment is mine, and you yourself said you wanted to take a break from our relationship. Well, toxic people don't let their sisters live with them for free. Maura tried to soften her tone. I was upset. That's not what I meant. No, I interrupted. You said exactly what you thought. You showed me your entire attitude. Her voice rose, more desperate. You can't do this. Where are we going to live? We don't even have enough money for a deposit or the first month's rent. It seems that's your problem, I said, keeping my voice low. Not mine. Christina, please, I'm sorry, we said too much, let's forget all this. 30 days, Maura, if you're still there in a month, I'll call the police. I hung up. The weekend passed in surprising silence. The phone rang occasionally, but I simply turned it off. I started cleaning, preparing food for several days ahead, doing laundry, and suddenly felt how ordinary tasks that had previously seemed routine turned into little islands of peace, the kind I'd longed for after all this family drama. On Monday morning, I was getting ready for work when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I peered through the peephole and was stunned. Everyone was standing on the landing at once: Mom, Gasper, Maura, and David. Their faces were tense, tired, as if they had barely slept a wink in days. I opened the door but didn't even move to invite them in. "We need to talk," Mom spoke first, her voice restrained but anxious. "About what?" I asked coldly. "About all of this," Gasper waved his hand vaguely, as if trying to summarize the whole pile of accumulated problems. "Everyone's been acting inappropriately lately. We need to calm down and resolve this peacefully." Maura stepped forward, her eyes shining, her lips trembling nervously. "I've thought about it and decided to accept your offer," she said. "What offer?" I narrowed my eyes. $20,000, she said. As if it were a word of salvation. "I agree, we can put everything behind us, you can come to the wedding, and David and I can stay in the apartment." I stared at her for several long seconds, and then I couldn't help but burst out laughing. The laughter burst out so suddenly and loudly that my stomach twisted. I laughed until tears came, until my shoulders trembled, and I couldn't stop. "Are you crazy?" I finally managed to squeeze out through my laughter, wiping my eyes with my palm. They all stood there, confused, as if I'd spoken a language they didn't understand. "Let me get this straight," I said, once my breathing had somewhat returned. "You invited me to dinner under false pretenses, surrounded me with strangers, and demanded $80,000. When I offered 20, you mocked me and called me toxic. You, Maura, declared that I was no longer part of the family, and now you come here and think I'll just give you 20,000 and let you live on rent?" Every word I uttered rang out in the ensuing silence. "You've shown me who you really are," I continued quietly but firmly, "and I want nothing to do with any of you anymore. Maura, you have 3 weeks left. I advise you to start looking for a new place today. Christina, please." Mom shuddered, reaching out her hands, but I retreated. "No," I snapped, "get out of my apartment, and, Maura, get out of my other apartment too." I closed the door in their faces and turned the key in the lock. Through the peephole, I watched as they milled around on the landing for a few more minutes, exchanging glances, exchanging nervous words, and then finally, slowly, they left. The next 3 weeks passed surprisingly quietly. No calls, no messages. Maura and David seemed to have vanished, and Mom and Gasper apparently realized I wasn't backing down. I used the time productively. I called contractors and got quotes for cosmetic repairs and painting. The apartment was generally in decent condition, but I knew a little updating would help raise the rent. The day before the eviction deadline, I went to my grandmother's apartment with Mr. Martinez. I asked him to accompany me, just in case anything went wrong. We parked across the street and waited. At exactly 2 o'clock, the apartment door opened, and Maura and David began carrying out boxes, loading them into the rented truck. Mom and Gasper were nearby, helping with the moving. Everyone looked tired and irritated. I watched Maura lugging a box labeled kitchen supplies and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sadness, no regret, only a quiet relief that this protracted mess was finally coming to an end. They noticed my car, parked across the street. Maura glared at me, her eyes sparkling, but I sat calmly and watched silently. David said something to her, shaking his head, probably urging her not to make a scene. Gasper, sullen and sweaty, carried out the television, while Mom lugged trash bags full of clothes. No one looked happy, but they continued packing because they had no other choice. By 4 o'clock, the truck was loaded to the brim, and everything was ready to go. Maura stepped aside, approached my car, and knocked loudly on the window. I leisurely rolled it down. "Here are your keys," she said, throwing the bunch forcefully out the window, where they landed in my lap. "Thank you," I replied politely. "I hope you're happy," she muttered. "Actually, yes," I said calmly, looking her straight in the eyes. Maura stared at me for a long moment, then turned abruptly and walked back to the truck. No one looked back as they drove away. Mr. Martinez and I went up to the apartment and looked it over. To my surprise, everything was much cleaner than I expected. They'd clearly taken care not to leave a mess behind. Just a few scuff marks on the walls, signs of normal wear and tear, but nothing serious. 2 weeks after the truck carrying Maura and David's belongings disappeared around the corner, workers arrived. They repainted the walls a soft cream shade, filled minor cracks, renewed the baseboards, cleaned the carpet, and by the end of the job, the space seemed transformed, as if it had regained its former dignity and well-maintained appearance. I stood in the empty rooms, inhaling the smell of fresh paint, and felt like this was the beginning of a completely new chapter in my life. When I listed my apartment for rent at $1,300 a month, I couldn't have imagined interest would rise so quickly, but within a week, 3 families were ready to move in. After much deliberation, I chose a young couple of teachers. They seemed calm, reliable, and responsible, and I saw gratitude in their eyes for the opportunity. On the first of the month, they moved in, paid the first month's rent, and carefully placed the deposit on the table. And then, for the first time, I felt, almost physically, a heavy weight lifted from my shoulders. Suddenly, I was earning over $15,000 a year in rent, money that I immediately decided to use to pay off the mortgage early. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life, like my decisions were starting to work for me, not against me. After that, everything settled into a calm, steady rhythm. I worked, went to the gym, saw friends, and pursued my little joys and hobbies. I gradually realized how much emotional energy was being spent on endless family conflicts, and once the chaos subsided, I suddenly discovered a wonderful sense of happiness and peace within myself that I hadn't felt in years. About 3 months later, while scrolling through my Facebook newsfeed, I stumbled upon Maura's wedding photos. The ceremony was modest, no expensive hotel, none of the glitz and glamour they so passionately demanded I pay for. Instead, it was a simple community center, decorated with modest garlands and flowers. Maura's dress was beautiful but simple, more elegant than luxurious. Everything looked decent enough, but certainly not $80,000, more like 15 or 20. Maura looked good in the photos, but in her eyes I didn't see that sparkle, that glow of happiness that a bride usually radiates on her wedding day. She seemed to be mechanically going through the motions, smiling, posing, but behind that smile, I sensed emptiness. David, on the other hand, looked content and calm. I caught myself feeling nothing as I looked at these images, no regret that I wasn't there, no longing for a lost connection. They had made their choice, I had made mine. 3 months later, late one evening, my phone suddenly rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. My heart sank, and I hesitated whether to answer or remain silent. Curiosity won out. "Hi, Christina," I heard her voice, slightly trembling. "We need to talk to you about Maura." "What's wrong with her?" I asked, unable to hide my irony. "She and David are having some financial difficulties. They're looking for a new place, and we were thinking maybe you could let them move back into Grandma's apartment, at least temporarily, until they get back on their feet." I laughed so loudly and sincerely that there was a long pause on the line. "Are you serious?" I finally said. "It's just temporary," Mom continued. "You could consider it helping the family." "Family?" I interrupted. "Maura literally called me toxic and cut me out of her life. You and Gasper supported her, and what makes you think I'd want to help them now?" "That was a few months ago," Mom sighed. "People say stupid things when they're upset. We all miss you, dear." "It's funny," I replied coldly. "You only miss me when you need something from me." "It's not fair," Mom whispered. "No, what's unfair is that you call me after months of silence and ask me to help Maura out again. The answer is no, absolutely not." "But where will they live?" Mom almost pleaded. "I don't know," I said wearily, "and honestly, I don't care. They're adults, they should figure this out themselves." "Christina, please." "No, Mom," I interrupted firmly, "I'm done with you. You've made it clear that I'm only valuable when I write checks. Well, the bank's closed." I hung up and immediately blocked all their numbers, and for the first time, I thought I should have done this months ago. It's been over a year since then. I have great tenants, they pay on time and take good care of the apartment. The rental income helps me pay off the mortgage much faster. And I now realize I'll pay it off in 5 years instead of 15. I've made new friends at work, allowed myself to date again, and a month ago, I went on vacation to Europe for the first time in my life, something that used to seem like an unattainable dream when I was funding other people's whims. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my family, and I honestly answer, no. What I miss is the very idea of a loving, supportive and protective family, but I never had that. I had people who saw me as nothing more than a wallet. A real family doesn't treat you like an ATM, doesn't ridicule you at the table, doesn't reject you for setting boundaries. Now I live differently, calmly, confidently, on my own terms. I spend money on what makes me happy, not on other people's whims. I have friends who love me for who I am, not for what I can do for them. Maura and David will cope with their own lives. Mom and Gasper will find someone to manipulate, and I can finally live freely, without fear, without humiliation, and without other people's demands, and exactly the way I want.